A lot of fearful avoidants go through a lot more than they can handle at a young age. So there's this comfort in the chaos. Like, okay, let me just take all these things on. And I'm used to having to deal with things that feel overwhelming or pressuring or beyond my ability to handle because I grew up in that kind of environment. Anxious attachment styles can be sensitive to shifts and changes in patterns when it could lead to abandonment, but fearful avoidants are hypervigilant with all of it, everything. So if you told a story 3 months ago and 3 months later, the story changed a little bit, fearful avoidants are going to pick it up. Like, they are human lie detectors.
Her name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to another episode of our podcast today with our amazing co-host, Mike DiZio. Today, we are going to be talking a lot about fearful avoidant triggers in relationships, the things that cause them to feel like they need to flee or shut down or self-protect, and the things that cause them to feel like their relationship is something to doubt, or they're not sure if they can see themselves investing in long term. So my hope for you is that if you are a fearful avoidant listening to this today, you are going to get some really deep insight into yourself and why things trigger you the way that you do, so you know what to be able to do next. Or if you are the loved one of a fearful avoidant attachment style listening, our hope is that you are going to gain some profound insight into your partner and how you can show up to be mindful of these things while also communicating if you have triggers that you want your partner to be mindful of as well. If you didn't already know this, Mike and I speak a lot from the internal world of what it's been like to be Mike, a previous dismissive avoidant before doing the work to become secure, and myself, a previous fearful avoidant before doing the work to become secure. So we're going to be sharing from that inside perspective and really go deep into some of this content. And what we're going to start by doing is just going through a few major points and triggers. And Mike, you can sort of start here and kick it off. And then I'll share a little bit more about the inside world of the fearful avoidant and what each of these things really feels like as the person going through them themselves, having once upon a time also been a fearful avoidant.
Okay, so to kick it off, there's a lot of FA triggers. As we know, the FAs do have a lot of sort of triggers because they have a lot of core wounds associated to fearful avoidance. So we'll start out with an FA gets really, really triggering when they feel like trust is broken. Obviously, any attachment style, like if there's a major trust violation, that's going to be really hurtful. But I was hoping you could expand on like the incongruency piece on it. Like FAs, it seems like when even something very small, like if your actions don't line up with your words, even if it's very, very small, and maybe you tell like a white lie because you think, oh, this is better, it won't hurt my partner's feelings. But if an FA sort of feels like the trust is even like a little bit sort of touched, they get really, really triggered. And then trust is, that's something they kind of always seem to remember. I know we mentioned in past episodes, I've debated a lot of fearful avoidance. And yeah, certain times where maybe I omitted something because I thought it would be better, it wouldn't hurt their feelings, or maybe they wouldn't get like super mad at me. I'm like, it's probably better I don't say this just so they don't, get super upset or super triggered. But then that ends up like biting you in the butt because then, yeah. And then that thing that you did, that thing that you thought was so little, that probably is going to be brought up like in the future multiple times. Like it's not just going to be forgotten or swept under the rug. So I was wondering if you can comment on sort of your experience in the past with sort of feeling if trust is broken, or if there's like minor trust violations, what's sort of the internal experience of the FA there?
Yeah, you know what? I thought of so many interesting, I have all these little like life flashbacks as you were talking, but I thought of so many really interesting parts of this. And, so I think for listeners, the first thing I want to give context for is that part of why fearful avoidants are so sensitive to incongruency, or to if a story changes or if anything changes, and we've talked about this on the show before, but part of the reason this happens is because fearful avoidants, when you look at an anxious attachment style, for example, their main attachment strategy is to maintain proximity, to keep getting closer to somebody and to not let that person separate from them. And that's how they feel like they could stay safe. Dismissive avoidance, they learned, okay, I'm not really getting my emotional needs or perhaps many needs at all met from my caregivers or parents. And so I'm going to get relief by just keeping distance and becoming hyper independent. And that made them feel relief. Fearful avoidance, they usually grew up in an environment where there is like so much chaos and confusion So as an example, maybe somebody had a parent who was an alcoholic, and one day that parent comes home and they're sober and they're nice and they're in a good mood and that's great and connection feels good. And another day they come home and they're binge drinking again and they're cruel and they're mean and they're harsh. And another day they're binge drinking, but it's earlier on and they're only, so upset or so angry. And another day they're sobering up and they're angry because they're going through withdrawals and they're detoxing. So it's like you never know what you're going to get. And of course, that's one of many examples. There could be a parent who had a personality disorder or lots of chaos, lots of fighting in the home, or a really bad divorce where the children are really brought in the middle and parentified at a young age. Like all of these things would be things that would likely create a fearful avoidant attachment style. But what happens is out of this, a child learns as their attachment strategy to basically try to predict a couple steps ahead. And this is known as hypervigilance. It's like if I can just read between the lines on everything and notice any little shifts and changes in behaviors, then I can adapt to this environment better and better protect myself as a result. And so what ends up taking place is you have a child who grows up in an environment like this, and they're basically constantly trying to read between the lines, which makes them hypersensitive to any little shift or change in patterns. And, anxious attachment styles can be sensitive to shift and changes in patterns when it could lead to abandonment, but fearful avoidants are hypervigilant with all of it, everything. So if you told a story 3 months ago and 3 months later, the story changed a little bit, fearful avoidants are going to pick it up. Like they are human lie detectors. And so what's funny is that, having been fearful avoidant, I'll say, because that was such a deep attachment strategy for me, I didn't know I was doing it. Like there was never a point where I'm like, oh, make sure you remember things so that you can catch someone later, or make sure I would just notice when something changed or notice when a story didn't add up. And I was very hypersensitive to incongruency. Like you say one thing and you do another, or you say one thing and then it changes the next day. Like anything like that, I would catch it right away. Even little changes in patterns. If somebody usually had one routine and then it changed, and I wouldn't be trying to do it. It was just in my nature. It was like so deep rooted for me for such a long time. And so, when I was fearful avoidant, I would make that mean like, oh, I can't trust this person. And then I would feel, unsafe in the situation, and not like physically unsafe or like, oh no, but like, I don't know, can I really invest in this? Like unsafe, like emotionally investing or committing. And I would get cold feet about things and I would push the person away. And the worst part is that at the time, I didn't know how to talk about these things. So I didn't know how to say, hey, I'm a little sensitive to these things. I don't know why something changed from here to here. Can we talk about it? Can we hash it out? Can you shed some light on this so that I can understand better? Like I didn't know how to have those conversations at first. So I would just shut down and push people away as a result. And so, and I think there's a part of it, right, where when you're fearful avoidant, if there's a lot of trust violations in childhood because of chaos or different things, you grow up thinking, well, if I can't trust my parents, how can I ever trust anybody at all? And so there's a really fragmented internal trust baseline. Like you're like, I can't trust anybody with anything. And it makes you feel like you have to really hyper rely on yourself and not get too close and not be too vulnerable, because there's almost this deep assumption like everybody's eventually going to hurt you really badly. So having worked through that, something that I noticed in my own shifts and patterns, which is so interesting because I've never said this out loud. It's just something I noticed internally over the years. When I first met my now husband, and we've been together for we're on our 10th year of being together right now. And so it's been a long time. But when I first met him, I had done a lot of internal work, but I wasn't secure yet. I had done a lot of internal work, but not relational work per se. And I at the beginning, had to learn how to talk about things and be more vulnerable. And that was some work for me to do with him. And then I would notice over the years, little changes in patterns. And at the first, let's say year 2 or 3 of the relationship, I would say, hey, I noticed this shift in a pattern. I'm just hypersensitive to this. I'm not trying to look at everything, but I just noticed this. You said this and then this happened. Can you just, share some transparency around it so I don't personalize it or don't take it to heart? And he was so good about that. And it would just resolve things. And then it was wow, this is a solvable problem. And I had done a lot of work on my own trust wounds and stuff first, and then did that work with him second. And then what's funny is I guess over the last 6 or 7 years, sometimes I'll notice a change in a pattern. I still notice things and I won't even address it. I just, in my head, what happens when I'm thinking of this now is that I'll be oh, it just must be something random. And I don't I think I don't give any charged meaning towards it anymore. And if I did see something that was worth addressing, I definitely would. But every so often I'll just notice something, and usually the first thought that comes to mind that I'll have is something like, oh, there's probably more to that story, or oh, he probably just didn't share a detail or forgot something. And I just like it doesn't I don't feel a compulsion to even have to hash it out, which is so
Well, and you're
crazy.
telling yourself, like, the better story now instead of before, I would always go to, like, worst case scenario. Oh, for sure something that's happening here. Now you're sort of going on the benefit of the doubt or sort of the better, story you can tell yourself. And
Yeah.
if it keeps going after that, then for sure you'll go approach your partner, but for the most part, if something happens once, you're not sort of, like, jumping all in, like, "What's going on here? Something bad's happening." That's
He's
amazing.
and I think so many times that we hashed it out in the first few years about stuff that, like, there was always something, like, that made sense in the end and that we talked out, and so I think that, like, it almost reconditioned my mindset to just assume the best, I guess, or, like, never and it's not even this big thing where I, like, think about it consciously and I'm like, "Oh, should I say something or not? No, I don't need to." It's just, like, I'll notice things and be like, "Oh, there's probably more to that," and I just move on, like, it's not even really a second thought, which is so interesting. But I guess, like, that's from building deep enough roots of trust over the years that it, like, changes your inner conditioning.
Yeah, that sounds so freeing because obviously if you're,
Yeah.
like, part a lot of the relationship, you're having that anxiety, so if you could just kinda let those things go, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question. So, a theme in past relationships with FAs was to do with the phone. The phone was sort of like a point of contention in some relationships, in the sense that my partner wanted to have, like, passwords. They thought, like, maybe they should have a password to my email. I'm kinda dating myself, but, like, email was way more, popular back then. You communicated with a lot more social contacts through email. So the partner was sort of very mistrustful about sort of who I was talking to, on the computer and then on the phone and stuff like that. So my question is, and again, going back to my first point, I probably wasn't totally transparent with, like, telling them exactly who I was talking to. Not that I was doing anything really terrible, but I just thought, oh, you know what? They might get a little upset that I'm talking to an old coworker who happens to be of the opposite sex. So my question is, knowing that your partner is FA, do you want to be just, like, super transparent and be like, have my passwords. Yeah, totally have, like, I'll leave my phone out on the desk. No password required, stuff like that. Because before I would get kind of offended and I would be like, I feel like they're really, like, violating me and trying to, like, take my independence away and control me a little bit by having these passwords, when really it was more to soothe their anxiety. So my question is, like, if you know your partner's at Faye, should you just be like overly transparent? Or should you sort of maintain a bit of boundaries of, like, hey, like, my email password is my email password. That's a bit of a private area. Where do you sort of stand on that?
That's a good question. So I'll speak from personal experience first, and then I'll give recommendations. So I think in my earlier life, like in my earlier serious relationships, so I had sort of 3 serious relationships before my husband, like serious for whatever age you are, right? Because this is all when I was quite young. But the first 2, I was definitely fearful, avoidant, leaning, dismissive. So I actually like never looked at anyone's phone. I was kind of
Mm,
like, didn't care, whatever. And then the next one was the long term when there was a lot of trust issues, like a lot of like lies and just different things. And listen, we both had a lot of stuff to work out. So I'm not like sitting here trying to give anybody a hard time. But that relationship, I would look through his phone. And I did it maybe
mm,
like once a month or something. And honestly, I was like, it was just the most like when I think of that time in my life, I just think of that as like absolute poison. Like I just think of that as being something that was like just so dark. And it's just like you had no foundation of trust. And so you lean on this as a coping mechanism. And it's not even like I would necessarily find all these terrible things. It's like I would breed into things. And I just think it was like the most poisonous thing because you're being really, like, I was being at the time when you're in that situation, like, I was the one who was being like untrustworthy by doing that, honestly.
mm, mm.
And then I would find little things to just further fuel my untrustworthiness, even if like objectively they weren't a big deal. It would be like the way he talked about me to a friend and said something when we were
Yep.
in an argument or like these things. And so, that after that relationship, when I got out of that relationship, I was like, I will never do that to myself again because that
Yeah.
was like, I just thought that was so poisonous.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is then I was really single for a little bit after that relationship, really did a lot of deep healing and like intentionally didn't date for a long time. And then The next serious relationship I got into after was with Graham, so with my husband. And I know you know that, but in case people are like, who's that? So interestingly enough, I would have never gone near his phone or anything, but something that he did really early on is he would just take my phone and use it for stuff. Like he would be, doing something, hanging out. He'd like put on a song on my phone or just things like naturally.
Yeah.
And then he over time would be like, "Oh, put a song on my phone," or like, "Can you do this with my phone?" or stuff like that. Neither of us ever had phone passwords, and I guess we had both done enough work before dating that it was just like a natural thing. But
Mhm.
because he was so open and transparent, I never even thought about looking through his phone. Like in 9 and a half, like going on 10 years of dating, I've never like looked through his messages. Like the only
Yeah.
times I've ever gone through something on his phone, he's like, "Hey, can you find this and text the person because I'm driving?" Like stuff like that.
Mm.
And it's so interesting. And I never really thought about it that much because there was just like transparency early on. I think that
Mm.
if he was very private with his phone, even if I had done a lot of work, I think anybody being too private and too
Yeah.
funny with their
Yeah.
phone, it just automatically raises a red flag. And I think that would have been something that I wouldn't have like left the relationship over or sabotaged. At the time, I was secure enough when I started dating him to be able to have a
Mhm.
conversation about that. Like I would have been able to say, "Hey, we've been together
Yeah.
now for a year or 2 years, or we're living together now. Like, I'd like us to be transparent with things and not like
Yeah.
I get the sense there's like something there that's obscured, or I might have like an honest conversation about it." But I think really if there's just this transparency around phones as a whole, I think it's healthy. And then of
100%.
course it's like each person's work to not feel like they need to go looking for things and to get to a point where you're at that space. But obviously, like the more there's just transparency as a whole in a relationship, the less
Yeah.
there's anything that would require somebody to behave differently, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the whole chicken and the egg thing. Like, I would have no reason to check your phone if you're being shady with your phone. Like,
Yeah.
always like covering it or like bringing it to the bathroom. It's with you when you shower. Like, never like being so afraid to leave it out in the open.
Yeah.
Then of course, what's the reason to check it? But then if somebody's um, open with it and leaving it out and no password and like, hey, do you mind just checking what time our reservation's at? And they pick up your phone, let them check it. It's that whole thing, right? So the more you, and especially with an FA, but obviously with anybody, the more you're just not, being weird with your phone and just like letting it sort of be there and do its thing, then the partner really shouldn't have a reason to check it when you're not home.
Totally. Yeah.
But
And and I think that that's an unhealthy thing to get into in a relationship, honestly. Like, I think
yeah,
for anybody listening who's ever done that, like, I think it should be a commitment to each person if you can. Like, I'm not
yeah,
gonna look through somebody's stuff. And if there's an issue, you should go to the person and say, "Hey, I have," I don't know, like what could happen. Let's say, for example, let's pretend that, okay, I'm dating somebody and late at night their phone's always going off and it's like 3 nights in a row. Like, I'd be like, "Hey, I'm concerned. Why do you get these like, messages at 3 a.m. over and over? Like, can we hash it out? Is there something you need to share with me or tell me?" And then I would vet to see how the person's behavior was after. Did it stop? Are there other red flags? And I would, make an effort to talk about those things and address them if they came up. And
mhm,
I think that's a healthy approach because you're not violating your own sense of boundaries and your own sense of like what's acceptable because it's untrustworthy to sneak and look. And
yeah,
so you're staying in your integrity, you're having conversations. And if you get more and more red flags, there's more an issue that they are not being resolved. Okay, well then you have to have a reconsideration of that relationship dynamic. But if it's like something small and there's usually a detail missing and then you hash it out and you're like, "Oh, their mom had to call them late at night for an issue," or whatever it is, and they share that with you and you chat with them and you hear their mom talking and whatever it is, like if those are the things, if it's a trustworthy relationship, having that conversation will grow the relationship, not shrink it. And if it's somebody who's not being trustworthy, then you'll just see a whole bunch of red flags take place after the fact.
yeah. That makes so much sense. So would you say would this be a good baseline rule that secure people generally give trust, and then if it's broken, then they'll end the relationship or take some drastic action, versus fearful avoidance, they don't trust until somebody proves that they're trustworthy. Does that does that
It was a
resonate?
really good question. I
Yeah.
think Um, it's really nuanced, but I would say secure people have a healthy baseline of trust, but they still let there be an earning. So I wouldn't have like just trusted my husband right away with like my bank information after our first date. Like there's things that you earn to a degree. And a lot of that quote unquote earning above that healthy baseline of trust to get to like a deeply trusting place came through conversations, came through if I saw something I didn't like or was a red flag at times in the relationship, which is normal when you're dating somebody or you go through the power struggle stage. Like, oh, there was an incongruency here or this happened here. By addressing it and seeing resolution and positive momentum, like every time that happens, even if it's like once or twice a year and for a couple of years, like when you do those things, trust gets more deeply built in because you're working through things together, resolving things together. But you start with a healthy baseline, right? So like again, like a secure person won't like trust the stranger on the street at 2 a.m. in the dark alleyway with their wallet. Like there's a baseline of trust. And then we earn, letting somebody have our wallet and banking information after we deeply know them and there's that trust established. So that's always going to be there to a certain degree. But I think with a fearful avoidant, it's a great question. With the fearful avoidant, I think that there is such a fragmented baseline of trust. Like I had that so deeply. And then on top of that, there's almost an impossibility of being able to earn the trust. Like there's instead this dynamic of like, even if you ABC, people are going to be humans. They're going to have an incongruency sometimes, or they're going to forget to say something, or they're going to be late to something, or whatever it is. And because avoidants are so hypersensitive to seeing into all of it and then giving it so much meaning after, like, oh, it must mean that all of these bad things are happening. It's like, it's hard to ever really get a footing with a fearful avoidant who's really got to do the work.
Yeah, I understand it's born out of insecure attachment, but I remember being offended a few times where it's like, man, I do things so well, like 99% of the time. And then at 1% where, I did a little misstep, I got absolutely like scorched for it. And I was like, oh, come on. But that makes sense. They're sort of hyper focused on anything that can deem them to get hurt or feels unsafe.
I just want to jump in here and let you know that we are doing a 14-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below. You said something so important, which is, and we've talked about this too before, but every time an attachment style has like a really deep rooted issue, we outsource it out to other people. So because I didn't know how to trust, I would be like, oh, anybody I date better be never making a mistake with any detail ever, because I'm expecting perfection from somebody where I have no idea how to get momentum. And I was like that in early relationships, very much so. I would, any tiny white lie now, or any tiny change in detail or whatever, like now I can't trust you at all. And so it's like, okay, well, that's a really extreme thing, but we see that with different attachment styles. Like DAs are like, we should never have a conflict because they don't know how to do conflict in a healthy way and hash things out. Or APs are like, you should always be there to soothe me because they don't know how to self-soothe. So we tend to outsource our biggest challenges onto the other person, but all that does is just cause that person to have the expectation of perfection. And so I totally saw myself being on the other side of your situation. Like somebody could be showing up really, really well and I would scorch them for like the tiniest thing. And it's sad thinking about that going back, like, wow, like somebody was trying so hard to show up and I would just find the smallest thing and make it into a big thing. But it's coming from trauma. It's coming from a place of like, that's got to be the inner work. And I really want to encourage people to do that inner work because honest to goodness, living like that is freaking exhausting. Like it is exhausting. It's painful. It's hard. It's hard on you. It's hard on the other person. So definitely worth working through.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, should we go on to our next trigger?
Yes, definitely.
Another FA trigger would be people having expectations for them. I'm imagining that's like high expectations, or is that expectations in general? They just don't want any.
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
A little bit of both. I mean, it's something when you become secure, it changes. You have a different understanding and relationship to it. But I think in a really big way, fearful avoidance because they put so much demand on themselves in relationships. A lot of fearful avoidance, and I'll speak from personal experience, and maybe it's relatable to people. But when I was fearful avoidant, I definitely believed a few things subconsciously. I believed that I had to earn my worth. So I thought that I had to show up as the best partner or the best this or best that or do the most in the relationship just to be worthy of love in some way. So felt like I really had to earn love, earn my worth in the relationship. I felt like if I ever made a mistake, I was like terrible, like so bad, and had a big I am bad core wound sponsoring that, and would feel a lot of shame around mistakes or if I did something wrong and really beat myself up for it. And then I would also feel this sense of like, not good enough. And so I was sensitive to criticism. So I had these like deep, like I have to earn love and I have to be perfect all the time. And I have so much shame if I make a mistake. And so what that leads you to is this output of like putting yourself under immense pressure in a relationship to always say the right thing, always do the right thing, always this. And I think that if you're living like that and you're over giving and under receiving and you're trying to over deliver and always make sure you're giving more than the other person is so you can feel worthy and safe. I think what happens is the moment somebody comes to you and they're like, oh, you didn't do this, you're like, excuse me? How dare you? Do you know all the things that and and so, yeah, I would really take criticism to heart, and I would take it like criticism in the form of an expectation. I guess the better way of saying it is like I would receive somebody expecting or demanding something as a form of criticism and as a form of entitlement, and it would make me feel like, do you not see all of that I'm doing, everything that I'm trying to show up for? And I had no concept at one point in my life of um that you have to communicate needs. That like, hey, communicating needs is healthy and we should be doing it. And I can't mind read my partner all the time. And so they actually have to tell me if something's missing. But I would just take it so personally. And expectations actually were a big triggering thing for me for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And you guys, when I say you guys, I mean like fearful avoidance in general. You guys look like you're just taking on the world and like killing it. Like I can do this job, work 50 hours a week. I can do the household stuff. Like you guys have this image of just like you're a very high functioning individual. And I remember thinking for a lot of my partners, I'm like, wow, like I envy you. Like you get so much stuff done. Like you guys are like task masters. This is amazing. But then under the surface, you find out they're like, please help me. Like, can you just take some things off my plate? But they're not saying anything, so you don't know. And then eventually, like you said, then if you ask them for something else, or in addition to what they're doing, you could have like a pretty big explosion. But again, it's because we see that they're doing a lot, that you guys are doing a lot, but we don't necessarily think that it's more than you can handle.
Mm.
Because if I look at myself, I'd be like, why would I do more than I can handle? Like, I'm just going to create my own suffering and just like be miserable, right? But for the FAs that I've been with, I always just think, wow, like they're just super capable human beings and they operate at a very high level. But then we find out later that they're like, please, like, I wish you would just know that I need help sometimes. Like, I wish you would just, cook dinner tonight, or I wish you would just do this without me having to say anything. But as we know, like, you kind of got to say something sometimes. Of course, if you're a partner of anyone, you should obviously try to do things to help your partner and, be helpful in the relationship. But we just don't know the extent of how much an FA can be drowning and just having so much on their back because it's just not evident. So,
And I think there's so many important things that go into that you said. So I think like, maybe fearful avoidance listening aren't going to like this, but it's the truth. Like that's a fearful avoidant issue. I can share from personal experience again, like when I was like that, it's a subconscious comfort zone because a lot of fearful avoidants go through a lot more than they can handle at a young age. So there's this comfort in the chaos. Like, okay, let me just take all these things on. And I'm used to having to deal with things that feel overwhelming or pressuring or beyond my ability to handle because I grew up in that kind of environment. And so there's this strange mechanism of like, let's go back there again, which I think we don't consciously realize at the time. The second thing is that it's a boundary issue for the fearful avoidant. Like fearful avoidance, until you learn how to have boundaries, you're going to find yourself in that position over and over and over again. And like, that's not, I really want to talk this out with you because I think this is so interesting. And it's so interesting because it's funny, like you were on the receiving end of this And it's almost like we were playing out our individual patterns in different spaces. And so I think it's a really interesting thing to see. But, so I would lack boundaries in relationships. And then I would feel frustrated if the other person had a boundary or a request because I would take it personally. But beyond that, and we've kind of touched on this indirectly before, but I would think that somebody should know my needs, and let's say I was dating somebody dismissive avoidants take everything so literally. So like the idea that like somebody should know your needs that's not how the other person is operating. And I honestly want to hear you speak to that as having been dismissive avoidant, because I had to learn so deeply, and practice. Like if I'm vulnerable and I say my needs to somebody, I actually got so much support. It was one of the most beautiful things I learned in my healing journey. Like if I just said, hey, I need some support here, or I need this, or I need that, people showed up phenomenally on a general basis. And if they didn't, and they could never show up and they never met, then okay, they get phased out of my life a little bit over time. Like, I want reciprocity in relationships. But there was a time that I was like, people should mind read. That was basically my expectation. And I would get very offended when they didn't. And so it's funny because you're on the receiving end of that in a lot of relationships in your past, you said, with fearful avoidance. And I'm curious, like, what that felt like to you. I'd love to hear that other side of it.
Yeah, the analogy that was just sort of popping in my head, and I can relate this to sort of how I felt. It would be the equivalent of you being, let's say, the owner of a company, and then you have an employee who's like does a lot of stuff and very high level and gets a lot of stuff done. But on the flip side, you don't know that they might be like drowning in work, like they're actually taking on way more than they can handle. So then your observation is they seem to be doing all
Right.
right. Like, yeah, they're fine. They haven't, if they were overworked or if they were burdened, they would tell me like, so then when you go to them and be like, oh, hey, like, do you mind just doing that extra task this weekend? Like that would really help out. Of course they're gonna flip out because they're already carrying this huge load and then you're throwing more on them. So, then they get mad and they might not say anything at the time, but they might go away and be like, I hate this job. My boss doesn't understand me. And then maybe just leave the job without even, having a conversation because they're so afraid of looking like weak or incompetent or not good enough. So yeah, I would sort of equate it to that. Like you don't know, you're thinking you're doing everything okay. Then all of a sudden one day, your partner is like icing you out or not talking to you and upset. And you find out it's because you weren't being helpful enough or you weren't sort of supporting them the way they wanted to be supported. And it's kind of unfair. And like you said, if they ask, you're like, yeah, of course. Like, geez, you do so much. Like, I'd be happy to take some of that off your plate. But it's either like avoidant nature or human nature, where it's like the squeaky wheel gets oiled, and if you don't say anything, you're probably not going to get any oil. And yeah, go ahead.
Totally. Totally. I love those analogies too, like the office thing, right? That's such a good one. And like I really want to just like reiterate this for fearful avoidance listening. If you are overgiving and under receiving, but you never communicated to a partner or to a person in your life that you actually needed something, most fearful avoidance, they always seem fine because you're usually tough and you can handle things, and people won't know that you're struggling unless you learn how to be vulnerable and unless you learn how to open up and actually share that you need things. And so it's a big reason fearful avoidance leave relationships seemingly all of a sudden because they're not communicating their needs. And it's not the other person's job ever to read your mind. So, as much as it can be like, but I'm doing so much, they should know, listen, if you do communicate and you are vulnerable and they never show up to meet your needs, good. You're in the wrong relationship. Somebody's never going to meet your needs. You're not going to be in a reciprocal relationship. Time to reevaluate. But if you've never communicated when you're feeling vulnerable, overwhelmed, you've never asked for support, you don't open up about what you're looking for or needing in the relationship, it honestly can never be the other person's fault. And I think that that's something that happens far too often with fearful avoidance. And I wish I learned that earlier because it was so life-changing that once I actually did communicate, it was like, wow, people actually really do care to show up. And it was so positively reinforcing. And not everybody will. Sometimes you'll see that people don't. And then you can say, okay, not the right relationship for me. But it's just such a life-changing thing. And I think that's a big place that fearful avoidance deflect accountability because they don't know. And it's kind of like you build your own invisible prison that way. You take everything on, you feel so alone in it. You never
Mhm.
ask for help, and then you expect people to mind read, and nobody's a mind reader, and most people are not operating by those rules in the first place because they didn't grow up having to
Mm.
be hypervigilant in the same way. And so it's like you're to crack yourself out of that prison, you have to actually learn the power of vulnerability in your relationships.
Yeah, for sure. And I imagine, so I remember hearing before that one of the biggest complaints of employees is actually not lack of money, like not getting paid enough, but it's actually recognition and like appreciation. So I imagine this applies to fearful avoidance a lot, where it's like, do you even know like how much I'm like standing on my head for you in this job? Like, do you know what I do throughout a day? So I have a feeling that a lot of fearful avoidance appreciation would go such a long way, and in a relationship as well. Like just to let your partner know, hey, like just to let you know, like I see what you do, like at your job and like in the relationship, things like this. Like just want to let you know that like I think that's pretty impressive, and like I envy you for your ability to do all these things. So I imagine FAs would kind of feel like a little bit better if they know at least the person knows all the stuff that they're doing and how much they're sort of giving. Because if they're not given that recognition, they're kind of like, oh man, like I can't win here.
Definitely, and I think that, that's huge, like, that acknowledgement, but I actually think that the fearful avoidance relationship to it, and people can let me know in the comments theirs, but I'm gonna guess just based on, like, all the clients and all the conversations I've had over the years, and this was my experience too, is that it's less about, like, the appreciation from, like, a pride perspective, like, I wanted people to, like, wave the confetti
Mhm.
or whatever and say how great I am, like, it's actually not that at all, it's that you feel seen and it makes you feel less alone in all that you're taking on. And I think
Mhm.
that for a lot of fearful avoidance, you grow up and you're in an environment where it's like, whoa, this is so chaotic and it feels like nobody sees what you're going through or it feels like you're alone in it because people don't see
Yeah.
you. But sometimes if somebody's like, hey, I see you've got a lot on your plate. How are you doing? It's something like that where it's like checking in. Wow, like I'm not alone anymore. Like there tends to be that deep, and that will be one of the biggest manifestations of that core wound for a fearful avoidance. So you hit the nail on the head about, like, just that recognition, but you said the word yourself, you're, like, just seeing them, and I think that's
Yeah.
really the most important part of what that entails.
Okay, that makes so much sense. That's great. Okay, we'll go to our next FA trigger. Um, there was a time one in here. So feeling the relationship is taking up too much time. I thought that was really interesting. What was your past relationship with a partner who maybe wanted to take a lot of your time away? What did that sort of feel like, and why was that like a trigger?
Yeah, that was definitely when dating, like, more anxiously attached individuals, because obviously anxious attachment individuals polarize you more into your dismissive avoidance side, because fearful
Right.
avoidance have that anxious and avoidant for our listeners who probably know that anyways, but basically, time would feel like and really the it's we say time or it can sound like time on the outside, but it's really engulfment. It's really like feeling
Yeah.
trapped, feeling enmeshed. And I think what happens, and this was my experience when I was in younger relationships too, my experience would be that I felt like the moment I would get into a relationship, I knew intuitively on some level, inherently, I guess is a better word, that I was going to lose myself because I didn't
Mm.
know how to have boundaries. I didn't know how to communicate my own needs. So because I
Yeah.
didn't know how to do those things, and because I felt this pressure to like show up and be worthy and be lovable and all these things, and I saw that as an investment oriented thing, like not that that's who I am. I'm a worthy, lovable person like anybody else on the planet inherently. No, I saw it as like something you earn. So the moment you're in a committed relationship, okay, now you have to do a whole bunch of stuff for somebody else. You can't have your sense of self. And even things like your own like mission or vision or goals or dreams kind of get set aside because I would just be so enmeshed and become really codependent when I was in relationships. And so what that would happen is I would always feel this like background stressor or pressure, especially with more anxious leaning individuals, like, I don't have
Mhm.
time for me. I'm gone. And it would honestly feel like I remember driving one time and thinking of getting into a relationship. I could tell that somebody I was dating was trying to move it in that direction. And it was pretty early into dating, like just a couple of months. And I remember feeling like, okay, I'm about to lose myself here now, and thinking that that was really it in terms of the relationship to myself. And like the moment I'm in a committed relationship, I would feel like I'm gone. Like all of my visions or not visions, but like dreams or hopes or vision of the future what I was trying to say. Like all those things have to get swept aside. And so that's part of why commitment would feel like a really confronting process a lot of the time. And that's why I would feel like, oh, there's not enough time because I have to do for everybody else and everything else in terms of the expectations that I put on myself for life. And there's no time for like really considering what it is that I need or I want or carving out that space for myself.
Okay, then here's a huge question for you. Is there a bit of or a lot of fear for the fearful avoidant when considering having a child, like having their first child? Is there a worry that like, okay, all my goals, all this that I worked for in my career, these other areas, I'm gonna have to put all into this lovely child? But is there like a big anxiety that comes along with that because they don't want to lose all the time and focus that they had before?
I think for any major commitment that shows up for fearful avoidance, I think
Yeah.
you'll see this every step of the way. And I noticed that you were mentioning this earlier when you were talking about the different triggers and organizing them. And,
Yeah.
it's around any big commitment. It's around, moving in together. It's around committing from seeing each other to being in a relationship. And it tends to be just those big rites of passage. But then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, getting married and then having a child, or it's all those rites of passage. Even fearful avoidance will tend to get commitment fears around like a job. Like, oh my gosh, like,
Yeah.
is this really the right job? And you'll see for a lot of fearful avoidance, especially before doing the work, you'll see a lot of like ambivalence right around the big commitment. So even if you know it's like the right job or the right partner, and you're like, okay, this is the person that I would see myself really being with, or this is the job I definitely want and was shooting for, and finally I got an offer. Usually, even if you know that it's good, suddenly, just as you're getting close to accepting the offer or taking the next step in the relationship, it's like, wait, and it's like this pinballing, and you'll see that ambivalence come up where it's like back and forth and back and
Yeah.
forth. And it's just a big thing for fearful avoidance. And again, I see that ambivalence as being rooted in, or at least one or two of the main roots is in being rooted in that you don't necessarily trust yourself to have boundaries and to not lose yourself completely to the thing that you're committing to.
Yeah, exactly. As I was looking at some of the lists here of how we're talking about any major step forward in a relationship will trigger a fearful avoidant, and these are all, like you said, rites of passage and things that are supposed to be usually like so amazing and so celebrated. One of them was going ring shopping, so I'm wondering like if you're ring shop with your partner and you know they're fearful avoidant, will you actually like notice them during the process, like kind of visibly uncomfortable? Or will they be like sort of internalize it? You wouldn't even know that they're like freaking out a little bit.
Probably internalize it. It's
Yeah.
people wouldn't say also do this thing where they put other people's feelings before theirs because they feel more into what people their focus. It's not like they're actually like feeling other people's feelings per se, but it's like
Yeah.
they're more externally focused on the outside world than the inside world until they start doing the work. And so what you'll see is that you usually, as a fearful avoidant, you're hypersensitive to what other people are thinking and feeling or what they could think and feel rather than like what's going on inside of you. And so even if
Mhm.
you know that this is making you uncomfortable, here you are, and you know that you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable by expressing your discomfort, so you'll prioritize that. And great, fearful avoidance tend to be great at like masking that or stuffing that down. And so that's why there's such a big theme for fearful avoidance, where sometimes they'll just leave relationships for the other person on the receiving end totally out of the blue. The other person will
Yeah.
be like, what? Like, what do you mean you're leaving or you're pushing away or we're about to move in and now you're cutting the cord? Like, what do you mean? But it's easy
Mhm.
because fearful ones can really mask how they're feeling for a long time towards their partner first. And again, that has to be solved through the fearful avoidant practicing vulnerability and like allowing themselves to take up space in relationships and allowing their feelings or fears or concerns to be heard so that they can actually
Yeah.
get resolved. And if you don't do that, you're going to keep seeing this ongoing pattern.
For sure. So obviously, we know this is more of something you need to do for yourself and whatnot. But if you are the partner, let's say, of a fearful avoidant, and you're taking one of these major steps, major rites of passage in your life, is there sort of something you can say to sort of like buffer that and make them a little less fearful? Like if you're, buying a house and moving in together, can you say like, kind of emphasize with not emphasize, empathize with them and be like, hey, I know moving in is like a really big step, but just to let you know, like we're in this together. If there's anything that's not working, I want you to let me know right away. Or if you're feeling uncomfortable, like what are sort of some things you might be able to say during these major life periods that could sort of lessen a fearful avoidance anxiety?
These are such good questions. I'm laughing to myself because I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how much of this is like really on the other person, but tell you all the layers. Layer
Yeah.
one would be to acknowledge that it's a big commitment, but
Yeah.
to reassure the person that you're not scared of it. Because if you were like, this is a big commitment, do you want to hash out what we're concerned about? They're like, oh,
Yeah.
what are you concerned about? And they're focused on that. And then they're thinking, oh, are you going to abandon or betray or, things like that. So to start off,
Mhm.
what you would do, in a perfect world and again, I want to go, I'll preface this by saying like, not all of this is just on the one person's responsibility, but you would start by saying something like, hey, we're moving in together. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really excited. I also want to acknowledge that it's a big commitment. It's something I've thought long and hard about, and I'm, very much looking forward to it. But I notice you don't express, your needs sometimes a lot, or you don't share your boundaries. And I'm wondering if you have concerns, because it would be normal too. And I would
Mhm.
love to just say, like, hey, if you have any fears or worries, bring them to me. Let's talk about them. Let's hash them out so we feel really good
Yeah.
about it going into this. And that would be the best thing, because fearful avoidance, like, they often, when they have concerns, they don't normalize them. They make a concern in a relationship mean that, like, the relationship must be wrong, instead of like, oh, I'm just having concerns and fears. And concerns and fears are meant to be addressed, yes, within, but especially in a relationship around big commitments, they're meant to be addressed with the other person. Like, that's part of the beauty of relationships, is we're meant to be able to take this to somebody and say, hey, I'm concerned that I'm going to lose myself if we move in together, if that was somebody's fear. And
Mhm.
I wanna make sure that I have, Tuesdays and Thursdays to myself sometimes to do my own thing, and when we live together, can we do that? Like, those things can be brought up, and you'd be so surprised. I think this is for fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance both. When they think of commitments, you'd be so surprised how many things when you start doing this are just solvable problems, like, very easily, very simply solvable problems. And so if you can say, "Hey, this is a concern I have. And how can we solve for it? Here's a strategy." And then the other person's like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do that, which is going to happen way more often than you think. You start to realize,
Mhm.
like, oh, relationships aren't so scary. I don't have to lose myself. I don't have to lose everything about myself. I can take up space and share about the things that I need, and actually be able to keep those things well in a commitment or relationship to somebody else.
Exactly. And like a secure person or anxious leaning person would much rather hear early on, your concerns and worries so they can work with you. Like they want to make this a comfortable process. Like maybe for them moving in is like super exciting and they're not thinking of anything negative, but they don't know that you might have all these fears underneath the surface. So they'll want to hear about it and they'll want to work with you because they don't want to hear, 2 years down the road that you just packed your stuff and left. So definitely you want to bring up those early concerns and, your partner should want to work with you. Like those are big commitments to them too, right? So if they're taking those major steps, they're sort of proving to you like, hey, I'm here for the long haul. So let's do this as a partnership. Like it's not just all me deciding what's best for the relationship. Okay, so moving on to our last FA trigger of the day would be feeling unimportant or like they don't matter. So again, this would be something no one wants to feel unimportant or no one wants to feel like they don't matter. But why is this such like a deep cutting trigger and wound for the FA specifically?
Yeah, such a good one. So I think there's two parts to this. One is because there's also this like underlying fear for FAs of abandonment. And so if somebody's not present or paying attention or making an effort to show that you matter, oh my gosh, this could also lead to that abandonment trigger. And then they go hand in hand. And then you can spiral and worry. And a lot of fearful avoidance, if they feel like they're going to be abandoned, they won't necessarily activate like you would see with an anxious person. They're not going to be like, oh, let me get closer to you and make sure you don't abandon me. A lot of times instead, they're like, oh, let me reject you so you don't hurt me. And so that can happen. They can deactivate or stonewall or things like that. The other one is that I don't matter is such a big shadow for a fearful avoidant. And what a shadow means really is like when somebody else is doing something to you. I mean, there's a lot more to it. And we talk a lot about shadow work on this channel and things like that. But you can think of one entry point into your shadow. And this is based off the work of Carl Jung, is if somebody is doing something to you and you're very sensitive to it and you take it very personally, oftentimes it's because it actually is personal to you. In other words, it's because you're doing it
Mhm.
to yourself. And a lot of fearful avoidants perpetually make their feelings, their needs, and their boundaries not matter in relationships. They play so small. They don't let themselves be seen or heard or known or taken into consideration. They're hoping somebody will figure out how to see or hear or know them without ever sharing themselves nearly enough. And so when you make yourself not matter and those parts of yourself not matter, Of course, when somebody does that back to you and isn't present or isn't making an effort or doesn't go out of the way for you the way that you go out of your way for them, you're gonna both feel, oh my gosh, this is so painful because somebody's treating you in the way that you're treating yourself, and it will feel like the straw that broke the camel's back. But on top of that, there's gonna be a part of this where it's like, wait, do you even care? Are you gonna abandon me? Can I trust that you're gonna stay? And maybe he needs to shut you out first so that you don't hurt me too badly.
Makes so much sense. And then in early days of dating, when an FA is with someone and the person's kind of treating them like, oh, they don't really matter that much or not really that important, that's going to be the FA's comfort zone. And they're probably going to really feel comfortable there and just stay in that type of situation.
Yeah.
Whereas the flip side, if you had somebody come along and they're making an FA feel like so important and like they matter so much, will an FA just be like, oh, like this feels weird, like get away from me?
100%. Honestly, a lot of times fearful avoidance, if somebody's trying too hard, it's so far out of their comfort zone that they won't trust it, usually number one.
Yeah.
And number
Yeah.
two, they often feel like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm worthy and deserving of this," and they may actually sabotage. A lot of fearful avoidance will say to me, Thais, I'm dating somebody, they have all these great things going on paper. They're amazing in all these ways. They do so much, but I just feel like I'm bored. I just feel like they're boring or I'm bored. And it's because they're used to chaos. If your whole nervous system is functioned in chaos your entire life and that's all you know, when somebody's really stable and healthy and shows up and is present and prioritizes you and does everything right, it can feel so foreign to your subconscious mind. And your subconscious mind at the end of the day is like, I just want safety, and safety equals familiarity. And so if I've been surviving in the chaos, I still want chaos because I know how to survive in it. Whereas if somebody's too stable and healthy, that can actually feel threatening and confusing. And so funnily enough, our conscious mind can be like, that's what I want and want to strive for, but the subconscious mind may sabotage. And at the end of the day, as you know so well, and as a lot of listeners know on this channel, your subconscious mind is running the show. It's responsible for 95+% of your beliefs and your thoughts and your emotions and actions.
That was probably the thing that helped me change the most, was just realizing that I'm not running the show. Like I'm not steering the ship with these, 90,000 thoughts that are happening every day. As much as you think you're sort of choosing the best thing for yourself, if you just look, your patterns, you're having the same sort of situations, the same relationships, the same type of friendships. So you're actually you're not really in control until you find out what's going on in the back end. And I equate it to computer programming. Like to make a computer program run properly, you have to actually go in the back end and see what's going on in the source code. Graham would know this better, but it's not the source code. But you actually have to look what is in the back end. What are the things that are actually driving the ship? And until you check those things out, you think you have full control of your life. You're like, of course I do. I'm making every decision every day, all the time. You're absolutely not the one sort of in the driver's seat. So it's, we have to look back there. We have to uncover what's going on and then do the reprogramming to right the ship, basically.
100%. I love that. So we're going to end on that for today. We really dove deep into these major triggers of fearful avoidance. Stay tuned for a part 2 where we're going to go into some other triggers and sort of wounds more interpersonally in the relationship. And hopefully this was valuable for you today in a relatable way, made you maybe feel seen or known or understood. And we're going to do a whole bunch more on this in our next episode, so stay tuned. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube if you can. Or if you're listening to us on your favorite streaming platform, you can check us out on YouTube or vice versa. If you watch on YouTube and you want company on your drive to and from work or on a Sunday afternoon when you're running errands, you can check us out over there. You can also learn more about Mike in the description box down below. We'll put links to his social media. And thank you so much for watching and for being here. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth. And thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.